Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein. Georgia's elections have been under a microscope for years, and the pressure on the people who run them has only intensified. Former Secretary of State Cathy Cox knows what it was like to oversee elections before the modern-day battles over public trust became such a dominant part of our politics. And former Republican State Representative Scot Turner has watched those fights play out from inside his party and inside the legislature. They're both now volunteering with Keep Our Republic, a bipartisan effort focused on strengthening confidence in elections and the institutions that administer them. The group also includes longtime Democratic and Republican officials from across Georgia, and they'll soon take their message on the road with events in Atlanta, Columbus, and Savannah. So we want to start with the big picture. How much has the job of running elections changed? Why has faith in the system eroded? And what will Georgia's next leaders inherit when they take office? Secretary Cox and Representative Turner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Greg.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Secretary, let's start with you. You're now president of Georgia College and State University, but you were the state elections chief during a pretty tumultuous time in the early 2000s. You engineered a plan to put touchscreen voting machines in every single Georgia precinct for the first time. When you look back at what a Secretary of State faced back then and what they face now compared with your time in office, how much different has the job changed?
We thought it was tumultuous back in the early 2000s. And a lot of the focus on elections began in the year 2000 in the infamous Bush versus Gore presidential election, when people mostly remember the Florida experience, when there was a long, drawn-out recount in Florida, and you have images of the election inspectors holding up magnifying glasses to the punch card voting ballot style. And people began to think about voting styles and election equipment, probably for the first time in our lifetimes. But it was during that recount episode, I was serving as Secretary of State, that we said, well, let's take a look at what happened in Georgia. And we did a quick study, and found out, much to our shock, that Georgia lost some 94,000 votes for president in that 2000 election.
Wow.
Because of this hodgepodge of voting equipment that we were using at the time. At the time, every county got to use whatever kind of voting equipment they wanted to use. And we had a mess on our hands. The press and the media, the world really didn't focus on Georgia's experience despite that high error rate, because Bush beat Gore by more than 94,000 votes. So even if we could have reconstructed it, it wouldn't have changed our outcome, unlike the Florida experience that was so much closer proportionally. But it shocked us and shocked our senses into the reality that we needed to make some serious changes in our election process to have a more accurate voting system. And so that began to unfold our whole study of election equipment. We implemented the 21st Century Vote Commission the next year with bipartisan support from the legislature and election officials around the state. And out of that study came the recommendation to move to a first time ever uniform system of voting all over the state, and the recommendation from that commission that we moved to the first touchscreen voting system, to get a system that would enable voters to better have a vote that better reflected their choices.
And Secretary, I remember covering the education tours that your office did way back when, 20-something years ago, to inform Georgia voters on how this process will work. We still have a front page edition of the AJC hanging in one of our legislative offices about the rollout of that system. It was celebrated back then. Has it surprised you how now the touchscreen systems are under such scrutiny and distrust from segments of the Georgia electorate?
No, it hasn't been a surprise, because as soon as we put a computer in front of voters, we began to get a lot of people who raise questions. What they fail to understand is that computers had been a part of the voting system for decades. Even the punch cards were counted by a computer. We had, various systems that were in place well before 2000 that used computers that had no real security, no real testing. and people just didn't see it at the polling place, so they didn't think about it. But when we put an actual computer that they were familiar with in front of them, people began to raise a lot more questions. So interesting to me, and I've had a lot of questions with Secretary Raffensperger and his staff, a lot of the same people that are raising the questions today really sort of stalked me for the remaining years of my tenure as Secretary of State, raising questions about the system we had. Unfortunately, in the early 2000s, there was no technology that had a paper ballot as a part of the touch screens. I was delighted that Secretary Raffensperger was able to get a new system eventually that gave you the paper component so that voters could touch on a screen, make corrections, and see their choices on a piece of paper that was auditable in ways that our earlier technology was not. So that was a big improvement to the system that was not available in the early 2000s.
Representative Scott, Representative Turner, I should say, I want to get your thoughts on this because, look, you're a Republican who's now very, very much involved with election law policy, also a podcaster at Peach Pundit, who talks about not just election law policy, but the politics of the day frequently. And you've watched your party grow more skeptical over voting administration, the process. So obviously Donald Trump is at the center of it, but are there other factors why you think that this distrust has seemed to grow?
Well, I think what has changed from when Secretary Cox was there is that now almost every administrative decision is viewed through a very partisan lens. When I was in the legislature, election administration was certainly a political issue, but we could still spend a lot of time talking with our friends from across the aisle about things like whether a process worked or whether the law was clear or how much it was going to cost. But more and more, the first question people are asking themselves when they're in the legislature who are making these policies is who benefits politically. And I think that makes governing a whole lot harder than it has to be. And Georgia also has this structural model that gets overlooked. We talk about the Georgia election system as though it's one election or one organization, but it's not. It's the Secretary of State that has responsibilities. The state election board has responsibilities. Legislature writes laws, but it's the 159 counties that are actually administering elections. So when something goes wrong, the public understandably wants to know who's accountable. And oftentimes that's not a very clean answer. And because of that structure, who was really at fault is sometimes the question. And people want to hold a single person accountable. The officials who are getting elected this year are going to inherit some really difficult questions. We're already examining what comes after Georgia's current voting system. They're going to have to deal with all kinds of issues that we haven't really thoroughly thought about before. Things like technology and cybersecurity, auditing, certification, the role of certification, division of authority between the state and local officials. And there's probably going to be litigation over where all those lines are drawn. But I think the biggest challenge is going to be this recent phenomenon that losing an election doesn't automatically mean believing the election was illegitimate. You don't build confidence by telling skeptical voters to shut up and trust the government. You have to do more than that. You have to build systems that are transparent. You have to have procedures that can be explained, meaningful audits, clear laws, election officials who are willing to answer those hard questions. And that's what Keep Our Republic is doing. They're creating those environments where those types of questions can be answered. And I also think there's a responsibility on political leaders, too. We should absolutely investigate legitimate problems. I've spent years working on weaknesses in Georgia's election system, but there's a serious difference between identifying a vulnerability and claiming that vulnerability changed an election. And I think if we want people to trust elections, we have to be disciplined enough to make that distinction for ourselves.
Let's stay with that, Representative and Secretary. Short of waving a magic wand and rebuilding that trust in one fell swoop, what suggestions do you have to do so? Because we often talk about, the GOP mistrust in election system, the MAGA supporters mistrust. But look, the latest AJC polls have also showed an increasing share of Democrats also share some sort of mistrust in the election results. And that's got to be concerning as well, that it's sort of a bipartisan concern now. Secretary?
Well, I think it's a matter of education is at the root of it, because I think it's easy for people who are trying to find fault. And I agree with Scott. It's just because your side loses an election does not mean there's a problem. And that has become a lot of our default by elected officials, even not necessarily their election, but one at the top of the ticket, for example. That's not the case. And I think the more we can educate voters, the more we can educate elected officials by particularly using those 159 county election officials who are on the ground, who know the granular workings of these systems inside and out, to help them understand, help all of those user populations understand how these systems work and not work, so that people don't jump to conclusions. We spent so much time in recent years talking about those suitcases of ballots that were brought in, when actually into the Fulton County election ballot counting arena, when that was a security method of keeping those paper copies safe. That was not anything nefarious, but we got people who took that 10 miles down the road as something bad without the opportunity to educate people on what is going wrong. And people jumping to the conclusion that we're scared of this because it involves a computer, and so we want to go to something hand marked, as if that is the gold standard, without understanding from those election officials what are the complicating factors to a system like that. All of these systems have pros and cons. All of them have extra costs that fall on a state or a county. And so it's an involved process. But the more we can help people understand, I think the more they feel better about the way their votes count, just like Scott said.
Yeah, Representative, any more thoughts to add on that one?
Yeah, every election system is imperfect. There are trade-offs with all of them, and there are problems with all of them, and there are advantages with all of them. Nothing that any human being has ever created in the way of elections has been a perfect system. But I think what Georgia is doing at this point is really, especially in the legislature, as we watched the legislators who are leading these charges, like Victor Anderson, the chairman of the House Governmental Affairs Committee, they're taking a very serious mindset of continuous improvement. We cannot sit back and just pass an election law anymore and just say, all right, we fixed the problem. There's always going to be an evolving ecosystem of challenges that maybe we haven't even thought of yet, that we're going to have to continually come back and look at and evaluate. Is the current system working? Where can we make it better? Where did it fail? What solutions do we need to put in place? How much is it going to cost? How quickly can it be implemented? And is it something that our locals can administer? But I think one of the things that is really exciting about Keep Our Republic's work is that they are stepping in to create these environments where you, as an individual voter, if you have questions or concerns, you can ask your questions and have an expert who's actually a practitioner in elections answer it. That's super exciting. And this time, I think it's a resource that's going to pay huge dividends.
And we're going to get to some questions that I've solicited from folks, just to kind of give you guys like a warm up right after the break. But before we go to break, one more question for you guys from me, which is essentially, I'll never forget back in 2020, early 2021, going to covering some of these Stop the Steal rallies, where hardcore Republicans who have voted in a number of elections told me they just weren't going to vote in the runoff. So what do you say to someone who just tells you, whether they're Republican, Democrat, whatever, just tells you, I don't trust the machines, I don't trust the politicians, I don't trust the media. Why should I trust any of this? Secretary?
Well, that's not a new concern, and I've heard that even back to the dates when I was Secretary of State. We have opportunities. If you have some doubt about our ballot marking devices, the touchscreen systems that we have in polling places, you can cast a ballot by mail that uses one of the paper systems that count, by a Scantron. So there are other systems you can use in Georgia right now that have a different method of counting your ballot. But call your county official if you have doubts. Come to and participate in some of the Keep Our Republic events that are coming up, one in Atlanta, one in Savannah, one in Columbus, coming up in the next month or two, where you can get your questions answered by folks, as Scott said, who are running elections on the ground. These folks at the county level are happy to answer your questions and get your concerns resolved so that you will participate, because that's our objective at Keep Our Republic, is to get every voter comfortable with the voting system so they will participate.
I think this is a great place to take a break. When we come back, we're going to quiz our panelists on some of your questions. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. I'm Greg Bluestein. Before we get back to the show, a really quick note. Politically Georgia is powered by subscribers to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So if you already subscribe, thank you. And if you don't, you can join us right now at ajc.com/start. You can get full access to our reporting, our analysis, our subscriber newsletters like our morning newsletter, and special events throughout this election year. That's ajc.com/start. Okay, now we're going to put you both on the spot just a little bit, because when you take this program around Georgia, you're not just going to hear from people who already trust the system. You're going to hear lots of questions and some doubts and suspicions that, as Secretary Cox said, have been really circulating for decades. So I collected some of the broad questions that we heard from some readers recently and some listeners. Think of this as a preview of what you may encounter on the road. Let's start with this one. It's one that you've been getting a lot. Are Georgia's voting machines connected to the internet? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start, I guess. The voting machines can be connected to the internet for repairs by the technicians who are hired by the state and the county if somebody's out troubleshooting on election day and that kind of thing. But on election day, unless things have changed, and Scott may know more than me about this, on election day, the voting process, the voters, they are not connected to the internet, to my knowledge, which has always been a secure mechanism. They are not even connected to each other in a polling place in any way that somebody could fly by, connect in the internet and change all the votes by satellite, which was a big rumor that went around the world in previous elections. They are on the ground, standalone voting units that have a chip in each machine that is then uploaded, downloaded to transfer the votes into the counter at the end of each election date, final election date. That's always been one of the real secure mechanisms that brought me confidence in the system. Scott's been much more involved in the recent iterations of the system.
Yeah, I would say this. Let's say for a second they were connected to the internet. Let's just say a hacker, the worst case scenario has happened. A hacker has gained access to these machines via the internet. The balance is the paper ballot. Every voter prints off their ballot. They can read it for themselves and verify in the human language that I am voting for Donald Trump, or I am voting for Kamala Harris, or I am voting for Rick Jackson or Keisha Lance Bottoms. It's right there on the page. And then we have a process to verify those results in a post-election series of post-election audits, where when those are dropped into the scanner, there's an image that's created. Those images are then independently verified by various activists on both sides of the aisle to make sure that the counts are matching up with the results that are reported. And you have a hard copy paper ballot that can be recounted by hand if necessary. So even if they were somehow compromised during an election, the voter themselves reading their ballot is the defense against that. And then making sure that we have a process and laws in place that say, we're going with the human readable mark on this page that everybody can see for themselves. And therefore, we can validate the result.
Good answer. So this is the most frequent question we get at the AJC, but I'd love to pose it to you guys. Why can it take hours or sometimes even days to know who won an election? Of course, this is in part stemming from 2020, where a lot of people went to bed that night with Donald Trump leading Georgia. But of course, within days, Joe Biden had not gained the lead, but the tally showed he had the lead as ballots from Fulton County and Clayton County started coming in. So why does it take so long to know who won the election? Who wants that one?
Well, it doesn't always take so long.
Yeah.
You can't measure election administration by the year of 2020 for a lot of different reasons. I was on House Governmental Affairs, and we brought people onto the carpet to explain themselves for why it took so long. We were in a pandemic, and some of the counties were so strapped for workers to work the polls that they were hiring people the day before the election. And you didn't have enough qualified, trained people to be there all night and knew what to do. So you had a very limited number of people. And so you had this massive workload with a presidential election on the line with fewer people because of the pandemic. What we have seen, especially after the passage of SB 202 by the Georgia General Assembly, is faster voter experience. The lines shortened as a result of that legislation. And also the reporting happened much faster. We now allow for the pre-processing, not tabulation, but pre-processing of our absentee ballots, as an example. That was not a thing before 2020. So we know basically the counties are processing those, getting them ready to be tabulated, and then they can tabulate the moment the polls close. That's why you always see our absentee ballots and early votes reported first, because they're able to get those very quickly now. So it's an outcropping of that continuous improvement mentality that I was talking about, where the legislature took a look at what happened in 2020, and then they put laws and regulations in place that dealt with those issues and improved the voter experience. And we are now getting faster results.
So think about that. We have about 4 buckets of ballots, of votes that have to get counted. Think about what happens before the final election day. You have people that early voted, that went to a location and early voted. So you've got those votes that have to be all tabulated and put into a system. You have people that voted by mail. When I was Secretary of State, you could not even open those envelopes until 7 o'clock on the final election day. So sometimes people were opening envelopes all night. We let them open the envelopes early now. They can't do the counting until after 7. Now we can actually run them through a machine. We just don't press that final button until 7 o'clock for anybody to know numbers. You also have people who vote on election day, and then you have people who vote and get a provisional ballot that has to be adjudicated to determine if it's valid. So some of those things, especially to get the certified results, take a couple of days. Now, you have a unofficial tally now pretty much in Georgia, way ahead of other states, because we've made some of these changes to get some unofficial tallies that come in pretty well on election night. Other states are still opening envelopes for days, but we're working on much better systems here.
Let's do 2 more tune-up questions for Keep Our Republic. This one's another one. It might be an easy one, but this one's another one we get a lot. Could someone vote twice, vote in 2 states, or cast a ballot in the name of someone who died?
Well, they'd be committing a crime.
They can, but they'd be committing a federal offense and state offense.
They certainly. Has it happened? Yes. Does it change the results? No. It's extraordinarily rare. And we are catching people that do that. I think the state election board has recently cleared their backlog of cases from 2020. And there were several of those instances. Now, not all of them were nefarious. Some of them were misunderstandings. There were some people who moved between the time that they could register the vote. They wanted to vote. They moved to South Carolina. Was one in particular case, a real world example. A voter moved to South Carolina in that period where she could not register to vote there. She thought she was okay voting here. The state election board heard that case. They slapped her around some, and then they let her go. But those amount of votes that we saw that are in that category would not have changed the outcome. But we have a process that catches those things.
And here's a misunderstanding about the people talking about stuffing, early votes into a ballot box, a drop box. If you vote by mail and the election official gets your ballot, it gets marked on the system that you have voted. So if you try to show up at the polling place to vote again, it shows you've already voted. or if you tried to send in 5 absentee ballots, the first one is going to count and the others are not going to get counted because the system will show you've already voted, even if you go to another early voting place. So there are checks in the system to keep multiple votes from happening internally.
So it's probably prevented countless instances of that happening. Okay, final question. This is a good one. How do we know the final count is right? Like what audits, recounts, other checks happen after Election Day? Representative, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, this was my baby, the post-election audit, right? So we have a system right now, and it started very small, where we took one race. It was picked by the Secretary of State back in the old days to do a risk limiting audit, and we take the ballots and do a sample and hand count them to verify the result. And that has expanded over the years. We've seen multiple bills now where the number of races that we are auditing has grown. And then you have counties who are auditing 100% of the races from top to bottom on the ballot. It is fast. It is fairly easy. It is not something that is scary anymore. When we first pitched that, it was a hard sell. Any change to election administrators initially becomes a hard sell until they do it a couple times, they get it under their belt, they get that experience, and then they see the value in it. In 2020, the risk limiting audit is what was used by Secretary Raffensperger to create the 100% mandatory hand count, at least the first one. And then we had a second hand count of those ballots that verified the result. When you have paper where the voters are looking at their ballots and saying, this is the person that I voted for, that's step one. But there's also other processes too. So how do you keep people from stuffing the ballot box? How do you keep ballots just being printed randomly and stuffed into a box? Well, there's all kinds of records and logs of how many people voted, how they voted. Those things now have to be reported. On Election Day, the counties are responsible for saying, we sent out X number of absentee ballots to voters who requested them, and we received Y back. And then if that number mismatches with the total number of early votes or absentee votes that are cast, then we have something to look at there. But those records are matching. Our poll books are keeping track of when people show up to vote, how many people voted, when they voted. And so we can begin to build a database of this type of data, how many people cast their ballots, and compare it to the number of physical ballots that are in the boxes. And if those things mismatch, we have a process to deal with that as well. So there are any vulnerability that you have, the goal is to mitigate those risks through the process and through a series of checks so that the voters can have confidence that the actual count at the end of the day was accurate.
Well, thank you, Representative Turner. Thank you, Secretary Cox. Keep Our Republic is coming soon to a community near you. You can find them online. You can ask them plenty more questions. Representative Turner, he will go super deep. So you can ask him the most arcane policy questions possible, and he's going to answer it for you. That is going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel. Please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. And if you have questions about Georgia politics, you can call our hotline anytime, day or night, at 770-810-5297. You can also email us, politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. We love hearing from you. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.